Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Gems from the Wisdom Traditions. I'm so glad to have all of you here to share with us ideas on the idea of making a permanent change. The person who has come to kick off our conversation is someone who feels as if he was able to effect that permanent change in his own life after being greatly injured, and finding a somatic movement practice. Somatic meaning very much of a blending of the mind and the body working together. And that practice is the Feldenkrais method by Moshe Feldenkrais. Our speaker today is Uwe Mester, and he is a still and moving center Feldenkrais teacher after having been a practitioner for many, many years. He's an excellent, excellent teacher, and I think it has to do with something about the passion that he has for this practice and his also deep understanding of how it works. I know that it works, but I don't really understand why, and Uwe does. So Uwe, could you take it away? How do you see us being able to affect a permanent change through Feldenkrais?
Thanks all of you for coming here today. Or this evening. I know some of you are here on the East Coast too. Yeah, my name is Uwe. I'm not a real Vermonter, as you can hear by my accent and by my name. I'm from Germany. I just moved here about 13 years ago. And as Renee said, I'm a Feldenkrais practitioner, and the Feldenkrais method has obviously its name from its founder, or it's actually not obvious, because for some people they hear Feldenkrais and it doesn't sound like, you know, what is that? Is that like a spiritual movement? Is that something esoteric? What is it? So the name of the method comes from the founder, and his name was Moshe Feldenkrais. And I thought that I know that not all of you have heard of him and heard of his background, and I think it is important to hear a little bit his background, because this highly influenced his method and his findings. And I think I can throw in a couple of slides. If you would make me the co-host, then I have a little brief presentation of 5-10 minutes with some pictures of the man and of his life and who he interacted with, and that gives us a little bit of context. Yeah, the name Moshe Feldenkrais himself was born at the beginning of the last century, and he was born in Ukraine at the time. What nowadays is Ukraine, it was a part of Europe that kind of swapped between Poland, Russia, Ukraine. I put together a couple of images, a little bit like a couple of dates that might be interesting. Yeah, Moshe Feldenkrais, as I mentioned before, was born in a part that was at the time Russia, it's nowadays Ukraine. He immigrated at a very young age by himself at the age of 13 to Palestine at the time. So he was born and raised in a Jewish family. And he early on, he was like a construction worker. He helped building at the time like houses in Tel Aviv, what nowadays is Tel Aviv. And he was also an excellent athlete, soccer player, and he was also very strong in self-defense. And from the early age on, he had also like an interest in other realms, like for instance in auto-suggestion. At the time, he translated one of the first books on that topic. And what is interesting or important for his biography is that early on he had already like a knee injury, suffered from it, and at the time there was not really like a cure for it or a surgery. At the beginning of the 1930s, he moved to France and to Paris, and he studied at the famous University of the Sorbonne to become a mechanical engineer. And while he was there, he was also working in the laboratory of Curie, who won the Nobel Prize as the first female. So he was cutting edge physicist, really like on the top of the field, kind of like in his particular field. He also started to become a judo practitioner. He learned from the founder of judo in the 1930s, became one of the first black belts martial artists in judo. And judo, for people who are not so familiar with, is really a lot about, it's not that you throw punches or that you kick someone, but it's a lot about throws, about like pinning people on the floor. It's about breaking someone's balance. Is one of the key ideas. Then he also published books at the time on judo. He then, when the Nazis invaded France, he had to flee, and he flew like, you know, with a lot of documentation of from the laboratories from Curie to England at the time. And in England, he helped to defeat the Nazis, and he trained people like in self-defense technique. And he also at the time re-injured his other knee. So that is interesting, because later on he basically suffered from having like an injury on both knees that he could barely walk anymore. And at the time there were no surgical interventions, or the ones that were out there predicted that he would have a stiff knee, and that was not something that he wanted to deal with. And then he became interested about himself. He said, like, you know, well, if nobody else can help me from the medical field, well, let's see what I can do, if I can use my knowledge, like of physics, of martial art, of like, in order to get better. Because he realized that on some days he would have a lot of knee pain and he could barely walk, and on other days he would be better. And that kind of baffled him, because he couldn't see a relationship. There was not that he did a particular treatment, but it triggered his curiosity to say, what is it that I'm doing on certain days where I have no pain or no discomfort? And what do I do on the days where I have higher functioning? And that triggered for him like a 2-3 year long search for himself to figure out, what is it actually that I'm really doing? And he realized, I'm not really aware of what I'm doing and how I'm doing what I'm doing. And based on his findings, he developed then, like, he discovered for himself that the key for his improvement was awareness, that he would become aware of what are the ways how he could move, how is he usually moving, and what are kind of like alternative options. And based on that, he developed then his own way of getting better and become highly functional again. And then he started out to see, can that be transported to other people? What I found, how did I work with myself? Can that be used also for people with very different challenges in their life? And he found out that it was very helpful. And I go a little bit into depth in a moment, like, you know, what he did. Let me just finish up with a little bit of his biography. So he became very famous in Israel first. And then later, in the beginning of the 1970s, he also started to teach in the United States and at the Esalen Institute. He met with all kind of influential thinkers at the time and began to train people in the method that he developed. He also wrote four books on the method. And he died in the beginning of the 80s. Many of his beginning students took his work and also applied it then to other fields. So there are, you may not have heard maybe about Feldenkrais, but maybe you have heard about other like practitioners or initial trainers from his fields, like Anat Baniel, Chava Shelhav, Bones for Life, Thomas Hanner, who basically invented the term somatics, was also one of his students. So there are many people who were influenced by Moshe Feldenkrais. And to go back, like, how did he do it? Like, how did he get better? He looked at your whole self from a perspective. First of all, he wanted to understand the whole mechanics, the biomechanics. So he was a mechanical engineer, he was a physicist. So he was very interested, like, what are the forces? Why are the joints formed the way they are formed? How do that all works together? Not only like on a single joint, but how does it all work together? And that brought up the question, how do we learn in general? How do we learn to move? How can we improve movement? How do we form habits of movements? How can we develop alternatives to the way of habits? How can we become aware of habits? All these questions were very influential in his thinking and in the development of the method. And nowadays, people who go to Feldenkrais practitioners often come with particularly these questions that they say, hey, I'm having all kinds of challenges, often related to discomfort or pain, and I can't get better. And I've thought already like the whole medical field. And some of them have heard maybe Feldenkrais can help. So we, and I have to say from a personal point of view, I was in the same field at the time. When I was younger, I was an athlete and I injured myself and I had a back surgery and I couldn't get better. And at some point, someone suggested, why don't you try Feldenkrais? And I said, well, it was one of these things on the bucket list. When you're in chronic pain, you try everything. And I did it. And for me, it changed my life. I can definitely say that. And I definitely never envisioned that I would become a Feldenkrais practitioner and then now teach online with people who are joining in from Hawaii. Anyway, so there are many applications for the Feldenkrais method. And as Renee mentioned before, the Feldenkrais method itself is not a form of healing. Let me say this, like, I'm not a healer. Often people say, oh, you're a healer. I'm not a healer, yeah? What we do in Feldenkrais, it's an educational approach. It's not a medical approach. It's not an approach where I, quote unquote, treat people, where I diagnose people. But what I do is, or what we do is finding ways to create conditions that the person can improve and can get better. And we do that through movement. We do that through becoming aware of our whole self through movement and how we act in our environment and how do we learn in our environment. And I have here just like a little quote here from Yvon Joly is one of my mentors nowadays, and he has invested a lot of time into the field of, he's a Feldenkrais trainer, and he has invested a lot of time into the field of somatic education. I think he defines it very nicely by looking at the whole person from the body's subjective living experience. And what Renee mentioned before, like, where's the intersection, like, you know, body, mind, and so on? For us, it cannot be separated, these things. There is no body without a mind. There is no mind without a body, yeah? And this is very important for us, to us. And here I just throw in like a quote also like from Moshe Feldenkrais. This is front and center from him. And we have to think about it when he said these things, when he developed these things in the 1950s, in the 1960s, those were new ideas. They were like body and mind, how can they work together? Like, so we were really thinking in these separate fields. And nowadays we were also thinking at the time that the brain would not have the capacity to change, that the brain would be hardwired, while he at the time already said, this is not the case, this is not the case. But he couldn't prove it on a level that there were no functional imaging that could be made of the brain at the time. So he was not believed really. So, however, nowadays we have about 1,700 Feldenkrais practitioners in the United States, about 8,000 worldwide. And yeah, and I think this gives us a little bit like an overview of the man. I can obviously go in more details if you have more questions. I also think about if Feldenkrais can be easily taught to people in the Zoom format, even in the sitting position where you find yourself in. And if you're interested in it, I could throw in like maybe like a 5 or 7 minute long little exploration that you get a little bit idea. What does it mean to become aware of ourselves through movement? Okay. So I think that I'm gonna stop here to get a little bit like also your feedback, get a little bit more interactive, that you're not getting thrown with all that information at you. So, Renee, how would you like to do it, or to continue in this?
I think it's wonderful to give them an experience of Feldenkrais with you. Mm-hmm. So we're not just thinking about it, it's in the body.
Right. Okay, I hope you're all interested in that. And all you're going to need, ideally, is like a chair that you can sit on, and if possible, not your couch. So something that is a little bit firmer. You could also, if you want to sit on the floor, that will work too, as long as it is firm enough. So I would invite you to just get a chair. It can be, and if you can, if you just have like a very simple chair, it doesn't need like something special. It doesn't need an a special chair. Something that is firm and ideally flat, but if it is not totally flat, that's fine. And let's start out. Let me say a few words about Feldenkrais and how we teach. In order to become aware of our own self, we have to slow down quite a bit. Yeah. In order to learn, if we are not slowing down, we have no time to observe what has changed or what can change. And for us, central in the Feldenkrais method is that we learn to sense ourselves, because we use our senses to communicate with our whole central nervous system. And you could also say we communicate with our brain, like so that the brain gets more and more information through the senses, so that the brain gets more options now to choose. So what does that mean? Like, let's see a concrete example. Let's say you sit in your chair. Let's sit in your chair and just notice when you sit in your chair without changing anything, just if you can feel your sits bones, if you can feel the bottom of your pelvis. And if you can feel when you sit there, is your weight evenly distributed between the right and the left side? And you don't need to make any changes right away. You just want to become aware. So becoming aware means like not just like, oh, he asked this question, I want to change something, but just to notice something. Notice if you have more weight over one foot or the other. Just sense for yourself. Notice your breathing, like the movement that is being created through yourself as you breathe. Now, most of us have sit all our lives in some way, but often when I work with people, and I didn't know it myself when I started, I was not clear, how can my skeleton support myself in sitting? How can I use myself in the skeleton in a way to make it easier for my sitting? And on the bottom of our pelvis, we have the so-called sitting bones. You may have heard about it, but when you now sit, do you feel your sits bones? And let's see if when we become more aware and when we feel our sits bones more, if that changes the way how we experience ourselves in sitting. I would like you to take your hand and to bring your fingertips underneath your right buttock. So you sit on the right buttock, so that the fingertips kind of like are underneath the sits bones. You will feel there's like a bony structure there. And you sit on that bony structure. That is like the bottom of your pelvis. Those are your sits bones. And you keep your hand there. So the fingers are a little bit pinched. It's just like can be the fingertips. It doesn't need the whole hand. And you just sit there for a moment. And now, as you sit, you begin to rock yourself a tiny bit forwards and backwards. Just a very, very small movement that you can feel. You rock over your sits bones. You feel that movement. You rock over the fingertips. You feel the movement in your sits bones. Just take it. So it takes a small movement and go slower. Don't move so fast. If you move fast, you don't give your nervous system the time to observe if something changes. Just sense it. Just sense it. Can you sense the bottom there? And what kind of shape is that sitting bone in? Can you feel it's a little bit rounded? It has a rounded shape there. Now, after you've rocked a little bit forwards and backwards, now rock a tiny bit, maybe it's a quarter of an inch, it's really tiny, to the right and left of your sitting bone. So you feel a shifting a little bit. And notice how you do that. Notice how you have to use your whole self to do this tiny shifting. Can you feel that you have to, some of you beginning to move their trunk and their back a little bit, the head moves through space, or you use your feet. Can you feel that you have to use yourself just to create this tiny movement, shifting left and right over your sits bones, over your right sit bone? Now, after you've moved forwards and backwards before, and a little bit left and right, find a way to create a circular motion over that sitting bone. So you rock like around that sitting bone. It's a tiny movement. It's tiny, very tiny. And you can close your eyes, you can keep your eyes open, whatever you want. And make it small, make it very small. And clearly feel the bottom of your pelvis, your sitting bone. And then change the direction of that circling. Go the other way around. A small movement, very small. And you may notice when you go around that the circle is not very round, that there are places where you can go easily to, and then there are places where you feel, I don't know how to get to this part of that circle. It's somewhat harder or not so easy, right? Good. Now, after you've circled left and right, clockwise, counterclockwise, take your hand out, take your right hand out and sit again, and notice how you sit now. And just notice the feeling that you have. And notice if you can sense a difference in the way how you sit over your right buttock, over your right sit bone, and your left sit bone. After that short experiment, it's like an experiment, it's an experimental learning what we have here in Feldenkrais. It's not like a learning where I tell you what is happening. I teach you that you can experience something for yourself. Notice which side feels more heavy on the ground, which side feels more supporting you, like the right or the left sit bone. Is there a difference? After such a short time. And I mean, were you aware of where your sits bones are? Can you sense better where your sits bones are and how you use them to find support over them? And that's an important question. In all moments of sitting, also like when you are like, I know many of you do meditate. How do you sit? How do you sit and find the support? Now, let's see, and you may feel, hey, it feels a little bit asymmetrical here. It feels a little bit like, strange, after such a short moment. Now let's go to the other side that we also feel the other side. So you take the fingers of your left hand and bring them underneath your left sit bone, and you feel, so the fingers are a little bit squeezed, the fingertips there. And first you find the sit bone, and it may feel different, like, or it may feel the same. How often have we explored that area for ourselves, like the bottom of our pelvis? It's not that often that most of us bring attention to it. Often we don't bring attention to ourselves until it hurts, right? Now, begin here, once you found that sit bone, to rock a tiny bit, a little bit in front and in back of it. So it's like kind of it's like you just shift a little bit in front and back, and you feel the pressure shifting underneath your fingers there, like, you know, how your sit bone shifts over the fingers, a little bit more to the front, a little bit more to the back, more in the direction of your index finger than to the ring finger. Just a tiny bit, a small movement, a small movement. Good. And notice how you use yourself to do that. Like, so it's not just, you will sense that you have to use your whole body in a way, like to do that small shifting of weight. And if you think about it, when we move through life and when we walk, we constantly have to shift weight from one leg onto the other, right? Now, begin to shift a little bit to the right and left so that you feel you shift over the sit bones. It feels like as if you're like on the sit bone for a moment, and then a little bit to the right of it, and then you on it again, and then a little bit to the left of it. So you can see we are kind of playing, we are exploring the terrain there. Yeah. We're becoming more aware. Okay, where is that? How can I move? Can I move as easily to the right as I can move to the left, or do I have a preference? Now, after you have moved forwards and backwards slightly, a little bit left and right, what you do is basically you put these, and you could think there are points there in the front and the back, to the left and the right. You make a circular motion with yourself over your sits bones. So going all around, and take your time, not fast, but very slow. Notice which quarter of that circle is very easy for you to reach, which quarter is somewhat harder, or where you take like a shortcut, where you feel like you're not really around anymore. And that shows us a little bit about ourselves, because when we talk about it later, people will have different experience, and it depends on their own life experience and how we have used ourselves. Now, shift, do the movement in the opposite direction. So if you did it clockwise, do it counterclockwise, and so on, and go slowly, slow movement. Again, make sure you continue to breathe. Good. And then take your left hand out and notice now how you sit on your pelvis, on your sits bones. And notice, first of all, you may experience that it's more equal now. Yeah? But also, if you have a different sense of yourself and a different sense of how you find the support through your skeleton. And maybe the sitting is a little bit less effortful. Notice that. Notice how if finding the sits bones has changed the way how you sit. Good. So this is just like a little example, like a snippet of a whole lesson that I can teach. And lessons are usually about 30 to 45 minutes long. And often they are done like on the floor, but we can also have lessons in sitting. And I just wanted to give you an experience for yourself, how small movements with a lot of attention to ourselves can make a difference, in a relatively short time, yeah, in the feeling of ourselves. And when we sense ourselves more clearly, we can become more aware of what it is that we do, and finding also alternatives to, we talked about like making changes. Well, before we can make changes, we also need to know what is it that we're doing. Moshe Feldenkrais often said, if you don't know what you're doing, you can't do what you want. Well, it sounds very simple, but there's a lot of truth in it. And when you think about it, so often we're kind of like walking through the world and we are wondering, oh, how did I get here, right? All is like kind of like on the automatic pilot, yeah? We get to work in the car, and for 20 minutes we have a drive, and when the first time we go to that place, we pay a lot of attention. How do we find our way? Then we learn it, and then it goes onto the automatic pilot. And then if we do that road for 2 or 3 years, often we don't recognize even like, how did we get here? Yeah, and it's interesting, like that, how when we learn, how things then go to the background and we habituate to something. And we know that from other examples too. We know that also from other examples of using our senses. You know that we are here in Vermont, for instance, we have many farms, like cow farms. And if you go to one of these more bigger farms that are almost like industrial size, it doesn't smell very good, right? But if you speak to the farmer, he doesn't smell it anymore. Yeah, his brain, his nervous system has habituated already to the smell, to these senses, so his senses don't pick it up anymore. He can't smell it. We know that from other areas too for ourselves. Let's say you work in a very noisy environment. At the beginning, when you move in, you hear the street all the time. And after a while, you will notice, oh, I don't hear it anymore, or you adapt to it, right? You habituated to it. And then if someone comes from the country and says like, oh, this is very loud here, you would say, really? I don't notice this. Yeah? Just to give some examples how when we habituate to something and we don't pay attention to it anymore, it goes to the background of our experience. And we are moving within our habits, and we need habits. It's not like that we don't need habits. We definitely need habits, but it is good to be aware of our habits. And it's good to know if I have an option to do things a little bit differently, because that gives us a choice. If we always were moving on the autopilot, we have not really a choice. So I leave it like that. And I know I throw a lot at you. And I hope after having that experience, maybe it brought up some questions for you or some things you want to know.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Uwe. Today's new topic for the week is producing a permanent change. And you have in your talk, as you drew to a conclusion, especially pointed out that Feldenkrais is about becoming more aware so that we are choosers, which allows us to make the changes that we want to have in our lives. So,
and the key for us is in Feldenkrais, we use movement to do this. Yeah, that is like there are other methods and other modalities and traditions. And but in Feldenkrais, we do that through movement. And when we teach these group lessons, they are called awareness through movement. Awareness through movement. And it's not called like, it's not, it doesn't have the name awareness of movement, but awareness through movement. Questions?
I read a little bit of one of his books, and I got the sense that he felt that we learn so many habits growing up from out of the cradle, out of the womb, and then watching our parents move, and then it gets wrapped up with emotion. I wonder if you might speak a bit about that.
Right. So as a somatic as we said before, we're in the field of somatic education, and there are kind of 4 aspects that are central to somatic education. On the one hand is like learning, awareness, movement, and then the environment. And the environment plays a huge role in the way how we act, how we move, and we all know that. I mean, like I grew up in Germany, you grew up in a different part of the world, and there were also certain ways how we were shaped on the one hand through the way how we were brought up in our parents' household, but also in terms of like what culture and society expected of us. So let's look, for instance, like on the question of that there are certain movements, for instance, that were kind of where we, through our environment, often introduce like to change them or to sit. Let's say we just had the topic of sitting. We've been told, I assume that many of you have also been told, sit straight, right? Sit straight and don't be curled over, don't do this or that, but sit straight, like almost like a military person, like have the posture, sit straight. And then you follow that and you sit straight, and after about 2 minutes, when you don't pay attention to it anymore, you slump down, because nobody can hold that, because it is not human to sit straight. Yeah, sit straight in the military sense is like a straight piece, because there is not even a single straight bone in our body. Yeah. Anyway, so our environment definitely shapes ourselves, and we know that. I mean, like look at the people, like with the invention of the smartphone, just as a change in the environment, how much that has changed us as a culture. Yeah, and you can see that, like I have teenagers, they are very good with smartphone, they move it like, for them it's almost like a part of themselves, right? And for instance, we can say like, okay, because of the environment, we need the smartphone to survive. They need it also for their social contacts. So for instance, they become very good in the movement of their thumb. Like they are very quick, like blah, 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 blah. And if you use your thumb all the time, every day for many, many hours, it shows up also in your neural pathway. We can, for instance, then see in our brain that the part of the brain that represents the thumb, the movement of the thumb, grows over time. And it's bigger than other parts. For if you would compare the area of the thumb for my children with mine, there would be a big difference. And it shows again, like just as an example, how our environment or how our culture shapes us. The same is like, what kind of chair do we sit in? Most of us sit in a chair where the front of the chair is higher than the back. That already asks us to round ourselves and to round backwards, for instance, and to sit in a slump position. It's just the shape of the chair. If you look in other cultures where they don't have chairs, for instance, they have not the same problems and challenges that we have in a Western culture that uses chairs that are designed in this particular way. So we can say that we can definitely, well, we know that where you grow up, what culture you grew up, what kind of your upbringing were, not only because like of what kind of injuries and challenges you had in your face, but just like that part plays a huge role in the way how you use yourself, how you conduct yourself in your environment, how you interact, and how you move, and some of the challenges that you're going to face because of that. Did that answer your question, Ben?
Yes and no. I'm wondering about, is there an emotional component also to it?
Right. So here we come back. From our perspective, you can't separate, again, like, to say, okay, this is a cognitive part, this is emotional part, this is a physical part. It all goes together. You cannot separate it. Yeah. You can look at these parts, which is sometimes interesting. Yeah. But at the end, I mean, they're always, for any action, for anything that you do, you have an emotional part, you have a cognitive part, you need to be aware of your environment, and you have a movement part. These things are happening in everything that you do. We can maybe focus on the movement part, or we can focus on the emotional part, but we all know from ourselves, from our own experience, if we are, quote unquote, let's say we are in a better emotional state, that also has an impact on our feeling of ourselves and on our movement and on our on everything. The same is like if you feel you move better with more ease, and you find that also creates a different feeling for yourself. Yeah, you cannot separate these things. We like to, and this is one of these. The separations of our emotions, of our thinking, and of our body, so to say, as if the body is something else than the mind and different than the emotions. This is not, from a Feldenkrais perspective, it all goes together, and we cannot separate this. And it's all in your lived experience.
It's interesting when I hear you talk about Feldenkrais and him being a top-level physicist. Mechanical engineer, really highly evolved along scientific lines. Some people end up being complete materialists and therefore sort of determinalistic as a result, end up being fatalists. This produces this. I was brought up in this environment, and so therefore I am bound and determined to have this end result. And yet it seems that really cutting edge scientists have gone beyond that. And he seems to be one of those who says, yes, there's an influence, and it is possible for each of us to self-determine to a large extent. And he gives people a way of doing so.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. I mean, first of all, as you mentioned, he was really like, he came from the field of physics and martial arts, but he was a very curious guy. He was really looking in at the time. really in all kinds of like, what are ways, like also into yoga. He was looking into acupuncture. He looked into mystics, like he was influenced by Gurdjieff, by other thinkers of the time to really, he was not just like this straight physicist, kind of like not thinking beyond a certain like cause and effect. Yeah. And many of the things that he discovered were highly disputed at the time, yeah, in particular from the medical field. Yeah. But I mean, we all know that from ourselves. If we have to adapt, for instance, to a different environment. If you ever have moved somewhere else, well, then you are, or maybe you had the chance to live in another country where you have to learn another language. You will see how much, on the one hand, there's an environment, how much you bring there, and how much you have to adapt to a new environment, and how much you can adapt, how much you can learn. Yeah. Often this idea, oh, I cannot learn anymore. This is not what that would be totally thrown out the window by a Feldenkrais practitioner. We can learn at any stage in our life. Yeah. That doesn't mean like that we can maybe do the same athletic performances that we did when we were 20. Yeah. But we are very much focused on, often, as I said before, people come with challenges to us, or they want to learn a new skill. They want to learn, like, or they have a challenge, or they want to learn a skill. They want to, let's say, how do I get down to the floor? I have challenges. I can't get down to the floor and up to the floor from the floor anymore with ease, but I want to play with my grandchildren. How do I do that? Yeah. Without having a chair. So those are things that we can teach, and we can teach them at any age, for instance. And it's not then a question of just like, do I have to have like a muscle training here before, or do I have to be in the emotional state that I get down to the floor or not? Yeah.
Thank you. Kirk, you have a question for Uwe?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Uwe. Very interesting presentation. And I know another Feldenkrais practitioner who incorporates the practice or the modality with psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that she's found is that by observing the way a person walks or sits and moves, just very simple movements, in fact, like walking, that she can immediately see where the, let's say the imbalances are, mm-hmm. and where also the emotional and mental anxieties, therefore, have been lodged in the body in some way.
Right.
And that, and in fact, you can often tell that if there's been some sort of trauma, where it's what kind of trauma it might have been, if it was a mental or emotional one or physical one, that may have led them to now be experiencing like a chronic pain or chronic disease of some sort. So I just wonder if you could comment on that. That have you found that you also have your capacity to observe the way people move as also being connected with sort of their mental and emotional state, and very specifically maybe issues that they may have of that kind?
Yes and no. I mean, let's say this way. We don't have like a formula where we say, oh, if the person is not moving their pelvis, their emotional state or their sexual life is like impaired, or they don't feel fulfilled, or if they don't move. What we can see is, because we have been trained to see that how a person moves beyond to their own knowledge, like what they're doing, like. But that doesn't mean necessarily that this person, for instance, I may see that this person, interesting enough, like moves their shoulder or their chest in a certain way, let's say, and that I find interesting, or it moves it proportionally a lot relative to the movement of the head or to the movement of the pelvis. But that doesn't mean necessarily that the person who comes to me has a question about their chest or their pelvis. They may have a question like, oh, I have trouble with my feet. Yeah. But then I will look at the whole person. And I may not go to the feet. Yeah. and say there are certain things that are out of balance, so to say, not only at the feet, but at the whole person. And how can we get that more into a sense of balance there? Yeah. And when we find that through movement, yeah, so it's like in particular in private lessons, it's not like that we reflect all the childhood and traumas that people had in their life, but we often want to, like, a person very often comes with a specific issue to us, like, and it can be sometimes emotional. It can be something like, that they say, I can't process this or that. Yeah. But most of the time people come with challenges that are related to some discomfort or pain, but and then we know we have to be very, very careful, in particular with people that you mentioned before, like who have traumas. Yeah. How do we work with them? That we move very, very slowly, that we bring changes gradually, very gradually, not fast and quick. Yeah. Because the nervous system is built in a way, if you do something that is too fast and too quick, it will reject it, because it will look at it as a form of danger that cannot be integrated into your whole experience before, and you will definitely move back into the old. So I don't have, like, the background of being a psychologist. For sure, we know there are certain places that are sensitive to many people, where they, I wouldn't say store certain emotions, but we know that they are often, when we go, let's say, for instance, if we get movement into the chest, yeah, into the ribs, into the clavicles, the sternum, that those places that for many people have not been moved in a long time can affect then other things, like, their breathing gets fuller, they may experience again other emotions, they may feel like certain freedom that they discover, and that influences then again other parts. Yeah. But it's not that we can say, okay, someone with that diagnosis, let's say they have an anxiety here and there, and then we all go to the left shoulder or anything like that. We don't even have lessons where we say, or someone with back pain has to have exactly this lesson. There are over 1,500 lessons that Moshe Feldenkrais developed for this group lessons. Yeah, that's a huge variety. And we really have to see, what does that person need at this time? What does that person can learn at this time too? Yeah. Those are differences. There are people who have different backgrounds. We look at the person, we get information about it. Also, like, not only is it a knee, but what are you doing with your life? I mean, why do you need to walk better? Like, okay, you're a farmer, or you're doing this or that. Well, that's interesting, because then we can connect to the whole person's experience.
Thank you. David, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. Uwe, curious, the newer science about the fascial network through the body has revealed a lot of information that wasn't present back when this work was developed. And I'm curious if the newer Feldenkrais practitioners or people in the field have tied in what we're learning now about fascia and its ability to communicate signals throughout the body. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to fill in the blanks about this new information, and I'm seeing a lot of relationship between the trainings that I've had through yoga, mm-hmm. and also working with Eva there at Still and Moving Center and her Feldenkrais practice.
Right.
Looking for, yeah, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. So Moshe Feldenkrais, as I mentioned before, when he developed the method, he was working with many, many people together. And actually, interesting enough, there was kind of like a rush of new developments. For instance, at the time, Ida Rolf, who was a friend of Moshe Feldenkrais, who developed the Rolfing method, they worked together, and they worked together like, they were good friends. They presented at the same time, and they would find similar things. They have different approaches, yeah, but they would find that about like the connectiveness, and Ida Rolf had definitely more like the fascia, obviously, and like in getting really. I cannot speak enough like about Rolfing, because I'm not a Rolfer. But I just want to make sure that you understand that Moshe Feldenkrais was very much aware also like of fascia, a lot of things were not known at the time. Like when it came to fascia, many things are still developing. And there are many, I know about some Feldenkrais practitioners who have looked very deeply into these questions. We often have in our continuous education, people also presenting new research about certain things, like, you know, like about certain fascial connections. So for people who don't know what is fascia, what are you talking about? It's kind of like over all the muscles group, it's like kind of like a network. It's like over that is let me say, how can I explain? Yeah, if you're cooking and if you're cooking a steak, and I assume some people are cooking steak, and you know the silver thing that you have to cut out, because like if you keep that on, it kind of pulls the whole steak together. That kind of like little layer there, like this little, like it looks like a little skin there. This is fascia. This is a form of fascia. And you can imagine if you have that kind of fascia over your entire body, how that influences also the musculature, and with it also like the skeletal structure. So it's definitely a very interesting field of research, but it's not something that we as Feldenkrais practitioners are trained in.
Bob.
Yeah, I had a question. You know, when we went through the exercise, you know, when you first said, are you sitting more on your left or right side? My experience was I was sitting about on the same, you know, it felt the same.
Yep.
But when I put my hand under on both sides, it was pretty clear that I was sitting much more heavily on my left hand because I could feel it more in my fingers.
Right.
And I was just curious, how much do we have to learn to feel? Because to my mind, I was sitting perfectly straight, perfectly, you know, 50,
right.
50.
But that shows again, like your habit is so strong there. Like, you know, it's said, like, you know, when I asked the first question, for instance, like, how do you sit? Do you feel a difference between your sides? And you feel like, no, it feels absolutely right. But then you begin to explore, and then you discover it for yourself. Hey, I'm not really sitting totally symmetrical, but in my feeling, it is quote unquote symmetrical, right? So our ability to sense ourselves increases the more and more we bring attention to it, and more we do these kinds of explorations. At the beginning, when I started with Feldenkrais, I know that for myself, and the Feldenkrais practitioner, let's say you start laying out on your back, and he asked me, so which part of your body on the backside makes contact with the floor? I would say, well, maybe the head, the shoulders, what else? Like, I don't know. It really feels all the same. It feels like a big bubble, like, you know, is there something to feel there? I mean, like, is there really a difference? And then through the lessons, I discovered, oh my God, there can be really things, I can feel that. And when you can feel it, you can also then sense it better, and you can then direct it better. Yeah. If you don't feel yourself, it's very difficult to make any form of changes. If you don't sense yourself, it's very difficult to make changes. It's like kind of the foundation for any learning. In learning, you have to compare, right? You have to compare one thing to another. If everything feels the same, well, then we have to start, like, you know, how can we learn to feel differences?
Perfect. Thank you. Kevin, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I have the pleasure of being the ambassador of First Impressions for those of you I haven't met. And I often have the opportunity to talk to new students or people that call into the center. And a lot of times when I'm telling them about either Aldoa or Feldenkrais, because it's kind of foreign to a lot of people, I go through, you know, it's good for posture and just awareness of not just your body, but your breath, because I know you focus a lot of attention on that. So, you know, when they tell me that, oh, I don't need that because I'm a runner or something like that, besides what I've mentioned, what would you say, besides maybe injury prevention, what are some other benefits that you would have?
Well, I mean, I know how difficult it is to get people to come to a Feldenkrais class. Yeah, I mean, like, and it is not very popular. Let's say it like this. Like, generally speaking, most people have never heard about it. So it definitely is helpful if the person has a sense of curiosity. Yeah, if the person is not curious about learning something new, it's very difficult to get them interested. Like I know that also, let's say I work with someone in a private lesson, and the person, let's say it's a woman, and she feels a big change, and then she goes home, and then she talks to her husband, and she says, you have to go there, you have to do that, blah, blah, blah. And she drags him down to work with me. And I can tell you how often I had that experience, that he is not interested in any of that. He is not interested in sensing himself, into feeling himself, and into these little differences. And he's kind to me. He gets up afterwards and it doesn't say, oh, this is the greatest bullshit I ever did in my life. Yeah, but he clearly is not interested in himself or invested in some form, and that's fine. Nobody has to do it. You know, if you are curious and if you want to learn something about yourself, and if you want to, let's say, if you want to improve, let's say a runner. Often the runners are focused on, they want to improve their performance, right? They know everything about, let's say, how long they run, how long it takes them to run, what kind of shoes they have to wear, all those things. They're very aware, right? But if you ask them, what do you sense is happening in your body? And guess what? If you would sense yourself better, what happens in your body, you would run faster. Would you be interested in that? Maybe they would be, yeah? But you can also ask them, so let's say, for instance, when you run, do you sense how your right foot makes contact with the floor? How it rolls over the floor? You can, in some way, you can get a lot of information if you look at the sole of your foot, of your shoe, and you will see, hey, my running shoe is always weighing down here on that part and always there. So what does that show? That shows a little bit about their habit. If they run, you know, most of the time often they don't have a challenge or a problem. But if they run and continuously in staying in one-sidedness, so to say, for long periods, often they can, over time, then create a situation where they are getting into discomfort or pain. So it can be, on the one hand, you can say it can help you to run better, to have more enjoyment in your running, that your running is not only focused on how fast I'm running. Imagine you would feel yourself in running. Imagine you would feel what happens in your chest and your spine. You wouldn't mind, you wouldn't understand like how great that is, like, you know, how wonderful it is that you're not just chasing like, you know, how fast you run, but that you enjoy it, that you enjoy like yourself, like in movement. And well, you can invite them, and they can try it out, and maybe they will, you know. Many will not. I'm sorry, I don't want to discourage you, and I'm thankful for everybody. It's just like my own experience.
Uvo,
But I have,
this is Noah.
I have on the other hand, I have many people.
Can I add?
Yeah.
You should tell people how good Feldenkrais feels. Like, actually taking the class feels really good when you stand up at the end and you feel like you just got off the massage table. That is a sellable thing. Like, that is the first point I would lead with for people. Because
very good.
I've been taking Uve's class for over a year, and I would say like 85% of the time I end the lesson feeling like, that is amazing. I feel so good in my body right now. And, you know, that only takes 40 minutes. What? That's crazy.
Yeah, you can really do something for your self-improvement. And I totally agree with you, Noah, and thanks for hinting that to me. When I started with the Feldenkrais method, I didn't care what it was called, as long as I could get better. I wanted to feel better. I was in pain. Well, if you can move out of pain, that's not a small thing. No? And if you can feel better, if you can do something for yourself, not just like that someone else does it on you, but that you can do something for yourself and get better. Well, if that doesn't trigger your curiosity, I don't know. Yeah?
It's why we have still in moving centers Feldenkrais classes, is because I felt so much better when I finally found Feldenkrais after 8 years of back pain that nothing else could fix. But learning Feldenkrais has helped me take myself out of that. So I'm a believer too. I really want to thank you, Uwe, in particular, from this idea of getting a gems from the wisdom traditions, for bringing us up to speed with a man who was truly a genius in many different fields, and who used his genius in such a way that he allowed us to make significant differences in our own lives. He didn't, I think, like you, he didn't consider himself a healer. However, he found ways that each of us could heal ourselves, which is tremendously powerful, and that you brought up really beautifully. So I want to particularly thank you for that, and for the time you spent in creating a beautiful presentation for us on the screen, and particularly giving us the opportunity to sense it in the body. We have a lot to look forward to and a lot to be thankful to Uwe for today. So many, many thanks for talking with us about producing a permanent change in ourselves.
Well, thanks for inviting me and for this discussion. I really enjoyed it, and maybe it triggered some of your curiosity to come to one of these classes and try it out.
No doubt.
And I teach here also at the Still and Moving Center, and yeah, all you need is like this place at home that you can be on the floor. You don't need extra props, extra clothing, or anything.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Hope you have a wonderful Saturday and remainder of your weekend and week, and see how each of you and each of us can do some production of change in our life, change for the better.